Hamlet is not merely a play. It is a tale of doubt and certainty, set in the cold halls of Elsinore Castle in Denmark. It is the story of a prince facing a grand familial betrayal, trying to find truth in a world filled with masks, in the damp corridors where the shadows stretch long and the rain never ceases. We find a soul caught between the duty of revenge and the weight of existence. This is the chronicle of the Prince of Denmark, a journey through the misty graveyards and the silent libraries of a crumbling kingdom. Chapter 1: The Midnight Vigil and the Frozen Breath of Denmark. The stone battlements of Elsinore were not merely walls. They were the silent witnesses to a kingdom's decay. The night was a canvas of deep indigo and suffocating grey, where the mist from the North Sea crawled above the cliffs like the ghostly fingers of the drowned. Francisco, a soldier worn thin by the biting wind, paced the platform, his heart hammered against his ribs not from the cold, but from the terrifying expectation of the supernatural. When Bernardo arrived to relieve him, the tension was palpable. "Who's there?" Bernardo cried, a question that would echo through the entire story of Hamlet. For in this castle, no one was truly who they appeared to be. The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. Soon they were joined by Horatio, a man of books and reason, a scholar from the University of Wittenberg, who had come to Denmark to witness a funeral and stayed to witness nightmare. Horatio did not believe in ghosts. He believed in what could be measured, seen, and proven. But as the clock struck 1, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down to a low, mournful moan, and the temperature dropped until their breath hung in the air like frozen shrouds. Out of the swirling fog, the figure emerged. It walked with a heavy martial stalk, draped in the very armor King Hamlet had worn when he fought the ambitious Pole. Horatio's blood turned to ice. He saw the resemblance, the same frown, the same authoritative stance. He spoke to it, his voice trembling but firm, demanding it speak in the name of heaven. But the apparition remained as silent as the grave it had crawled out of. It moved with a sorrowful majesty, looking at them with eyes that held the secrets of 1,000 suns, before vanishing as the first cock crowed. Horatio knew then that this was no mere hallucination. It was a precursor of fierce event, a dark omen that the foundations of Denmark were rotting. The scholar's logic failed, replaced by a dread that only the library of the dead could explain. Meanwhile, inside the golden warmth of the great hall, the contrast was sickening. King Claudius held court, his voice dripping with forced honey as he spoke of mixed sorrow and joy. He spoke of his brothers, death as a natural transition, and his marriage to Gertrude as a necessity for the state's stability. B was a man of politics. a creature of the sun who hated the shadows. Beside him sat Gertrude, her face a mask of fragile composure, and in the corner, shrouded in the blackest silk, stood Hamlet. He was a dark ink blot on the king's colourful tapestry. When Claudius called him son, Hamlet's response was a sharp dagger, a little more than kin, and less than kind. He looked at his mother, not with hatred, but with a bewildered grief. How could the woman who cried like Niobe at his father's funeral now smile at the man who sat in his father's chair? Chapter 2. The Weight of the Crown and the Poisoned Advice. The court was a theatre of lies, and Hamlet was the only one who refused to learn his lines. After the king and queen departed, Hamlet was left alone in the echoing hall, the silence louder than any shout. His first great monologue poured out of him like blood from a fresh wound. He wished his, too solid flesh would melt, and he railed against the garden that the world had become. Put to Hamlet the speed with which his mother moved to the incestuous sheets of his uncle was a betrayal of the very concept of love. He felt the weight of the library. He had studied in Wittenberg philosophies of old, down under the reality of human frailty. In another wing of the castle, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Laertes was preparing to return to France, but before he left, he turned to his sister, Ophelia. They stood in a quiet room filled with the scent of dried lavender and old parchment. Laertes warned her against Hamlet's affections. He told her that a prince is not a master of his own heart. His choices belong to the state. Fear it, Ophelia, fear it, he whispered, sowing the seeds of doubt in her innocent mind. Ophelia, a creature of light and obedience, promised to lock his advice in her heart. Then entered Polonius, the patriarch of the house, a man who loved the sound of his own voice more than the truth itself. He gave Laertes a long list of maxims, neither a borrower nor a lender be, and to thine own self be true. These were the words of a man who lived by rules and services, a man who could not see the storm brewing outside the castle window. Once Laertes departed, Polonius turned his cold, calculating gaze upon Ophelia. He demanded to know the truth of her relationship with Hamlet. When she confessed his holy vows of love, Polonius laughed a dry, hollow laugh. He forbade her from seeing the prince, treating her heart like a piece of property to be managed. Ophelia, with a bowed head and a heavy heart, uttered the words that would eventually lead to her doom. I shall obey, my lord. Chapter 3. The Ghost's Command and the Shattered Mind. The night air outside the castle walls was not just cold. It was predatory. Hamlet, Horatio, and Marcellus stood upon the battlements. their breath rising like ghostly incense in the moonlight. 'Tis their sounds of Claudius's revelry, trumpet blasts and the rhythmic beat of the kettle echoed from the warm halls below, marking every toast the king drank to his own vanity, to Hamlet. This custom was a stain on Denmark's reputation, a flaw in the noble substance of the nation. But his thoughts were abruptly severed as the air turned static and the mist parted. The ghost had returned. It did not speak to the guards with a scorn. It fixed its hollow, sorrowful gaze on the prince and beckoned him toward the jagged cliffs that overlooked the churning sea. It will not speak. Then I will follow it, Hamlet declared, his voice a mixture of terror and divine destiny. Horatio gripped his arm, fearing the spirit might lead the prince to madness or a watery grave. But Hamlet broke free with a strength born of desperation. He followed the armored shadow into the deeper darkness of the pines. When they were finally alone, the ghost turned. The silence that followed was heavier than the stones of Elsinore. Then the spirit spoke. It described the horrors of its purgatory, a place of sulphurous and tormenting flame, where it was forced to fast until the foul crimes committed in its days of nature were burnt and purged away. Then came the revelation that would burn Hamlet's world to ashes. The ghost described the afternoon in the orchard, the peaceful sleep of a king, and the brother who crept through the shadows with a vial of heat. The description was visceral, the poison curdling the blood like acid, the skin breaking out in a loathsome crust, the sudden, lonely passage into the afterlife without the chance for final prayer. Revenge is foul and most unnatural murder, the ghost commanded, as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon. The spirit vanished with a final, haunting cry. Adieu, 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 remember me. Hamlet was left alone, kneeling in the dirt, his mind fractured by the weight of a secret that demanded blood. Chapter 4. The Spider's Web and the Arrival of the Players. Weeks passed, and the castle of Elsinore transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion. Hamlet had successfully donned his disposition, wandering the galleries with his stockings fouled, and his gaze fixed on nothingness. He had become a ghost himself, paunt and living with his cryptic riddles and biting wit. Polonius, convinced that the prince's madness was a byproduct of prostrated love for Ophelia, set a trap. He hid himself and the king behind an arras to watch a meeting between the two. Hamlet, knowing he was being watched, unleashed a storm of bitter words upon the girl he once loved. "Get thee to a nunnery," he cried, his voice trembling with a predirected rage against his mother. Perceived infidelity. Ophelia was left shattered, her prayers falling on deaf ears as she mourned the noble mind that was now so overthrown. The king however, was not convinced by the madness of love. He sensed a deeper, more dangerous fire burning in Hamlet's eyes. It was at this moment of peak tension that the traveling players arrived. There were a burst of color in the monochrome misery of the court. Hamlet greeted them with a desperate enthusiasm. He asked the lead actor to perform a speech. Bow the fall of Troyspus, be the death of King Priam, and the agonizing grief of Queen Hecuba. As the actor wept for a fictional queen, Hamlet watched in self-loathing. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? He mused in the solitude of his library. If this actor could find such passion for a shadow, what should Hamlet do, who had a real father murdered and a real mother debased? The plan was born in that moment of artistic reflection. He would not rely solely on a ghost's word, for the devil has the power to assume a pleasing shape. He would use the theater to trap the truth. He instructed the players to perform a play titled The Mousetrap, the mirror of his father's murder. As he prepared for the performance, he sat in his study, the rain drumming against the leaded glass. He pondered the ultimate question of to be, poor, not to be. He weighed the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune against the sea of troubles he was destined to fight. He realized that the only thing that holds the hand from the blade is the dread of something after. Death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller. Chapter 5. The Night of the Mousetrap and the King's Terror. The great hall was transformed into a flickering arena of shadows and silent judgment. Hamlet had spent the hours before the performance, instructing the players with the precision of a master of ceremonies, urging them to hold the mirror up to nature. The court filed in procession of rustling silks and hushed whispers. King Claudius sat on his elevated throne, pale his face, a mask of royal composure, while Gertrude sat beside him, her eyes searching Hamlet's face for a glimmer of her old son. Hamlet, however, chose to sit at the feet of Ophelia, using his bitter wit to mask the pounding of his heart. The atmosphere was charged, like the air before a devastating lightning strike. As the pantomime began, the actors moved in a haunting silence, reenacting the garden scene. The player king fell asleep under a prop tree. Bile and the player murderer approached with the vial of poison. Hamlet's eyes were not on the stage. They were fixed like talons on the face of Claudius. When the poison was poured into the ear of the sleeping man, the king's composure shattered like glass. He rose, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a terror that no crown could hide. "Give me some light," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent hall. As the court scrambled in confusion, Hamlet remained in the darkness, a cold, triumphant smile playing on his lips. The ghost's word was no longer a shadow. It was a blood-stained reality. Following the chaos, Hamlet found himself summoned to his mother's closet. But on his way, he discovered Claudius alone in the royal chapel. The king was on his knees, his hands clasped in a desperate, hollow prayer. Hamlet drew his sword, the steel whispering as it left the scabbard. This was the moment of absolute justice. The murderer was vulnerable, his back turned. But Hamlet smiled. Always his greatest enemy intervened. He reasoned that to kill Claudius in the act of confession would be to send his soul to heaven. Be fate far too kind for such a monster. He sheathed his blade, deciding that the king must die in a moment of sin, ensuring a descent into the same sulphurous flames that tormented his father. Chapter 6. The Chamber of Mirrors and the Falling Arras. In the Queen's private chamber, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the weight of decades of secrets. Gertrude waited with a heart full of fear and indignation, while Polonius hid himself behind the heavy, embroidered arras to witness the confrontation. When Hamlet entered, he brought with him a storm of fury. He did not speak with the tongue of a son. He spoke with the voice of a judge. When the Queen attempted to rebuke him, he forced her to sit down and look into the glass of her own soul. The confrontation grew so violent that Gertrude, fearing for her life, cried out for help. From behind the tapestry, Polonius echoed her cry, thinking the king was hidden there. Hamlet lunged with his sword, the blade piercing the fabric with a sickening thud, as the body of the old counselor slumped to the floor. Hamlet pulled back the arrows to find the lifeless eyes of Polonius staring back at him. "Thou wretched, rash, intruding fool," Hamlet muttered, but he felt no remorse. He turned back to his mother, showing her to portraits, the godlike visage of his father and the shriveled, parasitic face of Claudius. His words were daggers, stripping away her excuses until she begged him to speak no more. For he had turned her eyes into her very soul, and there she saw black and grained spots. In the heat of this psychic war, the ghost appeared once more. It stood in the corner of the room, a pale, shimmering figure of grief, visible only to Hamlet. It reminded the prince of his blunted purpose and urged him to comfort his mother, who sat in a state of shock, watching her son talk to the empty air. Hamlet tried to point out the spirit, but Gertrude saw nothing but the vacancy of his madness. When the ghost vanished, Hamlet dragged the body of Polonius out of the room, leaving his mother in a state of spiritual ruin. The blood on the floor was the first of many stains that would soon cover the entire house of Denmark. Chapter 7. The Exile and the Pirates of the North Sea. Claudius, now fully aware that Hamlet was a direct threat to his life, acted with the cold efficiency of a cornered predator. He summoned Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet's childhood friends who had sold their loyalty for royal favor, ordered them to escort the prince to England. In their possession was a sealed mandate that carried Hamlet's death warrant. Hamlet, playing the part of the madman to the end, lead the king's guards on a grim chase through the castle before finally, agreeing to depart, he left Denmark as a prisoner, watched by the grey eyes of the sea and the silent, judging moon. On the voyage across the cold, turbulent waters of the North Sea, Hamlet's restlessness saved him. Unable to sleep, he crept into his companion's cabin and stole the royal packet. Breaking the seal, he read the command for his own execution. With a grim irony, he sat in the dark hold of the ship and used his skill in calligraphy to forge a new letter, ordering the immediate execution of Rosencrantz and upon their arrival in England. He sealed it with his father's signet ring, which he luckily carried in his purse. The library of his mind had taught him that in a world of treachery, one must become a master of the craft. The next day, a pirate ship of very warlike appointment attacked their vessel. In the heat of the boarding action, Hamlet proved his courage, leaping onto the pirate ship just as the two vessels parted. The pirates, finding a prince in their custody, treated him with a gentle thief's mercy, realizing he was a prize of great value. Hamlet was returned to the shores of Denmark, alone and changed. He had looked into the abyss of his own death and returned with a cold, singular focus. The time for words, for plays, and for hesitation had ended. The library was closing, and the final chapter of blood was about to be written. Chapter 8. The Dust of Kings and the Song of the Grave. The road back to Elsinore led Hamlet through a landscape that felt like a reflection of his own soul barrow. Mist-shrouded and silent, he was accompanied by Horatio, the only anchor he had left in a world of drifting shadows. As they approached the outskirts of the castle, they came upon a churchyard where the earth had been freshly turned. The smell of damp soil and ancient rot hung heavy in the air. Two grave diggers were at work, their shovels striking against stone and bone with a rhythmic, hollow thud. They sang crude songs and told dark jests, treating the house of death as if it were a common tavern. Hamlet watched them, fascinated by the custom of familiarity. They had developed with the end of all things. One of the gravediggers tossed a skull onto the muddy grass. Hamlet picked it up, feeling the cold, porous surface of what was once a human face. It was the skull of Yorick, the royal jester. Alas, for Yorick," Hamlet whispered, his voice caught in a throat tight with memory. He recalled the flashes of merriment that had once lit up the dark halls of his childhood, the lips he had kissed that were now nothing but grinning teeth and hollow sockets. In this graveyard, the dark academia of his studies met the absolute reality of the grave. He realized that Alexander the Great and the lowliest beggar both end, as a stopping for a beer barrel, the vanity of power, the beauty of Ophelia, the greed of Claudius, were destined to become the very dust that now covered his boots. The somber reflection was shattered by the arrival of a funeral procession. Hamlet and Horatio hid behind a large, lichen-covered monument. They watched as the king, the queen, and a vengeful Laertes followed a simple coffin. The rites were maimed and brief, signifying a death by one's own hand. When Hamlet realized it was Ophelia being lowered into the cold earth, his heart long frozen by Laertes, in a fit of grief, leaped into the grave to hold his sister one last time. Hamlet, unable to restrain himself, emerged from the shadows and leaped in after him. They grappled in the dirt, surrounded by the white flowers of a lost innocence, until they were pulled apart by the guards. Hamlet's cry echoed through the misty trees. "I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum." Chapter 9. The Final Trap and the Crimson Library. The following morning the castle was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a great storm. Hamlet sat in a secluded balcony with Horatio, recounting the spiritual combat he had faced at sea. He felt a strange sense of readiness, the frantic anxiety that had plagued him for months had been replaced by a cold, stoic calm. "If it be now, 'tis not to come," he told his friend. "The readiness is all." When Osric, a fawning courtier, arrived to deliver the challenge for the fencing match with Hamlet accepted it with a weary grace. He knew it was a trap, yet he walked toward it as if walking toward a long-awaited rest. The great hall was prepared for the spectacle. The court was gathered in a circle of hushed expectation. Claudius sat on his throne, the poisoned pearl hidden in his hand, a snake waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Laertes stood opposite Hamlet, his eyes burning with the poison of his own hatred. They chose their foils, and the duel began. The sound of the blades was like the ticking of a clock, counting down the final moments of the Danish monarchy. Hamlet won the first bout, then the second. The king offered the poisoned cup, but Hamlet refused. It was then that Queen Gertrude, in a final tragic act of maternal love, or perhaps fate, drank from the chalice. "Gertrude, do not drink," the king cried, but the wine of death had already touched her lips. The match turned violent. Laertes, desperate to fulfill his vow, lunged and wounded Hamlet with the poisoned tip. In the ensuing scuffle, they scabbarded their weapons, and in a moment of chaotic exchange, Hamlet ended up with Laertes' lethal blade. He struck back, wounding Laertes mortally. Suddenly, the queen collapsed, her life fleeing as she warned Hamlet of the cup. Laertes, falling to the floor, confessed the entire conspiracy. The king's to blame, he gasped. The library of lies had finally been burnt to the ground. Hamlet, with the last of his strength, turned the poisoned steel on Claudius, and then forced the king to drink the remainder of the venomous wine. The murderer died in the center of the wreckage he had created. Chapter 10. The rest is silence. Hamlet lay on the cold stone floor, poison racing through his veins like liquid fire. Horatio knelt beside him, weeping, beseeching for the cup to follow his friend into the darkness. But Hamlet stayed his hand. "Purport me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied," he whispered. He tasked Horatio with telling his story, the truth behind the madness. But the ghost and the blood, distant sound of drums announced the arrival of Fortinbras, the Norwegian prince who would claim the hollow throne. Hamlet's last breath was a soft sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 thoughts. The rest is silence. Horatio stood alone in the hall of corpses, the only witness to the tragedy. He looked down at the fallen prince and uttered the final benediction. "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." Outside, the rain had stopped, and a pale, watery sun began to rise over the cliffs of Elsinore. The story of Hamlet was over, leaving behind only the echoes of a noble mind that had tried to find light in a world of absolute shadow. The library was closed. The story of Elsinore has reached its end, and the echoes of the great hall have finally faded into the mist. The swords are sheathed, the secrets are laid to rest, and the restless spirits have found their peace in the velvet darkness of the night. As the last embers in the fireplace glow a soft, warm orange, it is time for you to let go of the day's burdens. The library is now quiet. The heavy oak doors are closed, shielding you from the storms of the world outside. Listen to the rhythmic patter of the rain against the glass. It is a lullaby for the soul, a gentle reminder that every struggle eventually finds its rest. Hamlet's journey is over, and now yours is to drift into the sanctuary of sleep. Let your thoughts dissolve like ink in water. Feel the weight of the blankets, the warmth of the hearth, fire, and the safety of these ancient walls. There are no more questions to answer, no more shadows to chase. The rest, as the prince once said, is silence. And in that silence, there is only peace. Close your eyes, breathe with the rhythm of the rain. Sleep now in the heart of the library. Good night, sweet one.